Hey guys, tonight we wander into corridors that flicker with torchlight, walls painted with heraldic beasts and ceilings that drip with the hush of expectation. You're not just standing in any palace, you're floating through its private chambers, where velvet curtains stir with draughts, and the silence feels heavy, like it's waiting for news that never quite arrives. Tonight, the subject is fertility, not the flowers in the field sort, but the uncomfortable, strangely ritualized world of royal fertility. You probably won't survive this if you're squeamish about weird, ancient remedies, but don't worry, it's all wrapped in silk, whispered prayers, and a little sarcastic commentary to make it go down smoother. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing those little dots of humanity scattered across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a long marble hallway, slippers tapping softly. The palace is awake, though no one admits it. Behind doors carved with oak leaves and crowned with gold, queens lie awake, and kings pace floors in worry. A dynasty is a fragile thing. It survives only if there is an heir. Without one, entire kingdoms tremble like a tower missing its keystone. Imagine being told your marriage is not just about romance, but about manufacturing stability for millions. Suddenly, your honeymoon suite comes with a committee. And yes, some dynasties practically invented stress. Take the Tudors, for example. Henry VIII might be history's most famous fertility panicker. He tore his kingdom from the Catholic Church, not because he was itching for theological debate, but because he was desperate for a legitimate son. That's one mainstream fact you can cling to tonight. Dynasties fell and wars sparked because one baby never arrived. But it wasn't just England. Across Europe, monarchs lived with the same ticking clock. Fertility wasn't private. It was a state matter like taxes or treaties. Courtiers whispered in galleries about queens who weren't quickening. Midwives kept journals. Servants counted menstrual cycles like farmers watching the moon. And you'd better smile at court feasts, even if the whole room knows your womb is late with results. Here's a fringe tidbit. In France, some believed that conception was more likely if the royal couple dined on rooster combs, animal testicles, or exotic fruits imported at ruinous expense. Picture a banquet of bizarre aphrodisiacs with powdered gold sprinkled over pears. Historians still argue whether these meals were sincerely believed to spark fertility or simply served as theatre, like eating oysters today, because it might help. In the moonlit silence of a royal chamber, the atmosphere is far less romantic than you'd expect. Candles burn in tall sconces, casting shadows across embroidered coverlets. The queen, draped in silk, lies very still, not because she's tired, but because she knows half the palace is speculating about this very moment. The king, meanwhile, has the weight of dynasty pressing down harder than any velvet crown. You might not expect it, but sometimes fertility rituals bordered on performance art. Couples were given instructions by priests: lie this way, pray that prayer, wear this charm on your wrist. Imagine being told to time your intimacy like an orchestra conductor. And conceive now. No pressure, right? In some places, astrologers were consulted before the bedchamber was entered. The stars had to align, not metaphorically, but literally. Conception on the wrong planetary hour could supposedly doom a child with weakness or ill fortune. Picture trying to explain that to your spouse. Sorry, dear, Mars is grumpy tonight. We'll try again Thursday. And the stakes? Oh, they were brutal. A queen who produced children was praised as nearly divine. One who did not was shamed, dismissed, or sometimes replaced entirely. Failure wasn't just personal, it was political. You didn't just disappoint your partner, you risked your throne. You glance again at the corridors lined with portraits of solemn kings and queens. Their eyes follow you, and you wonder how many of them smiled in oil paint while privately dreading what the cradle in the nursery might reveal, or not reveal. The silence of the palace is deceptive, Beneath it hums a tension sharper than any sword. Will there be an heir? And as you breathe in the wax and incense air of this world, you realize fertility wasn't simply about bodies. It was about survival, about power, and about a kind of ritualistic theatre that made intimacy less private and more like an audition. You smile a little, imagining the awkwardness. Fertility might be dressed in silks and prayers, but it was still two anxious people in a candlelit room, whispering fears to each other while the whole nation held its breath outside the door. You might not expect this, but the moment you step deeper into those endless corridors, you notice how every tapestry and carved column seems to whisper the same thing: dynasty. It doesn't matter whether the designs show hunting stags, coiled dragons, or golden lilies, the message stitched between the threads is the same: produce an heir, or the legacy ends. The weight of a dynasty isn't just symbolic. In medieval and early modern courts, the survival of a ruling family was tangled up with land, treaties, armies, and wealth. If a king died without a son, succession disputes could ignite like dry straw. You can almost hear the scraping of quills across parchment as lawyers draft contingency plans, treaties poised to dissolve, and cousins sharpening their claims. It's almost funny, kings who could command armies couldn't command their own bodies to follow a timetable. Take the Habsburgs. They were so obsessed with securing heirs that they inbred themselves into having the infamous Habsburg jaw, a chin so protruding that portraits sometimes looked more like caricature than reality. And yet, despite this awkward genetic souvenir, the family clung to the belief that keeping the bloodline pure meant stronger claims to power. Historians still argue whether this strategy was pragmatic, dynastic engineering, or just a slow-motion disaster dressed in silk. You pause in the imagined hall and think, what must it feel like to know the fate of a continent hinges on whether you conceive before your rival cousin does? Talk about pressure. Forget performance anxiety. This is empire anxiety. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some French and Spanish courts, newly married royals were cheered into their bedrooms with songs, laughter, and even bawdy jokes shouted by nobles. It wasn't meant to humiliate, well, not entirely. It was to make sure everyone knew the marriage was, let's say, activated. Picture being serenaded by your entire extended family while trying to look romantic in candlelight. Awkward doesn't begin to cover it. And yet beneath all that public festivity lurked private terror. What if nothing happened? What if months stretched into years with no swelling belly, no heir to present to the court? Queens often carried the blame. If there was no child, whispers grew sharp, and even kings, sometimes sterile themselves, shifted guilt toward their wives. You shuffle further into the scene, imagining a queen sitting alone in her chamber, embroidering while courtiers tally up her failures. She feels the dynasty pressing down like the weight of the jeweled crown she only wears on feast days. Every stitch in her embroidery might as well read, "Where is the heir?" Of course, kings weren't free of the burden. The mythology of masculinity meant a king had to appear virile. If he wasn't producing heirs, the rumour mill assumed the queen was barren. To admit otherwise was to threaten the illusion of royal strength, and illusions were as vital to power as armies. Still, the anxiety leaked through. Imagine Henry VIII storming through Hampton Court, convinced his wives were cursed, when in fact medical historians today suspect he might have carried a condition affecting fertility. The irony is delicious. A man divorcing, beheading, and reshaping an entire church, all because biology didn't read his memos. You step through another gallery, and the air feels thick with incense and candle smoke. Fertility wasn't just biology, it was bound to divine will. Success meant heaven's blessing. Failure meant God was displeased. That interpretation added another layer of stress, as if every missed pregnancy were a cosmic critique. So the dynasty becomes more than a family. It becomes a kind of living gamble. Will the line continue? Will the blood pass on? You can almost see a long chain of ancestors staring down from portraits, waiting to see if the next link will appear. The pressure is enough to turn any bedroom into a battlefield. The strange part? Despite all the rituals, the medicines, the chants, and the ceremonies, sometimes a baby just appeared without warning, after years of nothing, and when it did, everyone rushed to rewrite history, saying the prayers or potions must have worked. Historians still argue whether these successes were coincidence, science, or sheer chance dressed up as divine proof. And you, drifting through this world, notice how the silence of the palace is punctuated by the faint sound of quills scratching, tallying births and deaths like ledger books. Kings worried about rebellions, wars and famine, but nothing worried them more than an empty cradle. The dynasty, after all, was not just about love or family, it was about survival in the most brutal political game of all. And the terrifying truth? No one could really control it. Ever wondered what it feels like when your bed isn't just a bed, but a throne in disguise? You step softly now into a royal chamber where every embroidered pillow and gilded canopy is more than just decoration. It's part of the kingdom's survival kit. The bedchamber itself was almost a shrine, wrapped in tapestries and guarded by custom, because within those sheets rested not just two people, but the entire future of a dynasty. You lie back in the imagination of it. Velvet curtains pulled tight, guards stationed discreetly outside, and anxious courtiers pretending not to notice how long the candles keep burning. To us, a bed is private. To them, it was sacred, sometimes literally. Fertility was a ritual choreographed as carefully as a coronation, with kings and queens cast in roles they couldn't escape. Here's the mainstream fact sliding in. In some courts, especially medieval France, the so-called bedding ceremony marked the official consummation of a marriage. The couple was escorted to their chamber by nobles, priests blessed the sheets, and symbolic gestures, like placing a leg over the other or sprinkling holy water, announced the start of what was supposed to be the most personal act. Imagine having your first night turned into a public event with a guest list, awkward applause optional. And then there were the rules. Sacred beds required sacred duties. The queen was expected to lie in certain positions believed to encourage conception. Priests and physicians sometimes prescribed which nights to attempt, which herbs to burn, even which prayers to chant. Historians still argue whether these instructions were rooted in genuine medical theories of humours and balance, or whether they were simply as of ritual meant to soothe anxious monarchs. Either way, it wasn't exactly a carefree evening. Quirky tidbit for tonight. In Byzantine courts, fertility charms were sometimes sewn directly into the royal bed linens, tiny scraps of parchment inked with verses, stitched under layers of fabric so that intimacy was literally resting on holy words. Think of it like sleeping on a cross between scripture and superstition. You can almost picture the court seamstress muttering a prayer while sliding the needle through silk, hoping her work would produce a future emperor. As you wander around this imagined chamber, the air smells faintly of beeswax and lavender sachets stuffed into corners. The sacredness of the setting is almost suffocating. Every creak of the bed frame feels like it echoes through the entire palace. You can't help but joke to yourself. Talk about pressure. Even IKEA never promised furniture this political. And yet, the deeper truth is heavy. These sacred duties blurred the line between marriage and governance. Producing a child wasn't about joy or family, it was an act of state. Some monarchs treated their queens like vessels of dynastic continuity, not partners. The result was a strange cocktail of reverence and objectification. To fail meant risking not just personal heartbreak, but national crisis. You might notice, as you drift here, that many dynasties layered religion onto these rituals. If the queen conceived, it was framed as divine approval. If she did not, she might be accused of spiritual failings or hidden sins. Kings conveniently rarely bore such blame. Sacred duty became sacred scapegoating. The silent stretches punctuated by the flicker of candle flames on silk hangings. You can almost hear the low hum of a court official murmuring blessings, the rustle of parchment as records are kept, the faint breath of two royals lying rigid in a bed that feels more like an altar. And the strangest part? Many believed it worked. When a child was finally born, the rituals were credited. When one was not, more rituals were added. It was an endless spiral of hope stitched together with ceremony. Historians still debate whether these fertility practices provided genuine comfort or just prolonged the agony of waiting. Either way you sense it, the sacred bed was more than furniture. It was theatre, pressure, and faith woven into the very fabric of royal survival. You exhale slowly, imagining that heavy canopy pressing down with all the invisible weight of expectation. And you think, with a faint smile, no wonder insomnia was probably the most common royal disease. You might not expect this, but sometimes the most private of royal acts came with an audience. Picture the moment. Candles flickering low, velvet curtains drawn, and the royal couple finally tucked beneath embroidered sheets. And then, oh yes, half a dozen high-ranking nobles standing respectfully nearby, waiting to make sure the process was officially begun. Romantic? Not exactly, but for centuries, this strange custom of witnesses to consummation wasn't gossip or rumor, it was real. You shift in your imagination, feeling the discomfort of lying under such scrutiny. Your spouse turns to you, and you can practically hear the collective shuffle of courtiers holding their breath. This wasn't voyeurism for pleasure, it was politics, and heirs' legitimacy depended on proof that the marriage had been consummated. Without it, any child born later might be dismissed as illegitimate, a dangerous gap that rivals could exploit. Mainstream fact sliding in here. In medieval France and England, consummation ceremonies often involved nobles escorting the newlyweds to bed, sometimes even helping undress them down to their nightclothes before retiring to wait in an adjoining chamber. It wasn't that they wanted to stay, it was that the dynasty required evidence, and evidence meant eyes. The quirky detail: in some German states, the witnesses didn't leave. They lingered, seated at the edge of the bed, chatting politely until they were satisfied that the union was underway. Imagine making small talk with your uncle while trying to prove the future of your kingdom. Talk about multitasking under pressure. You breathe in the thick air of this imagined room, incense wafting, tapestries muffling the sounds. The ritual is both sacred and ridiculous, like a theatre performance where everyone knows their lines but no one wants to deliver them. Courtiers later spread whispers. Yes, the king touched her hand. Yes, the queen lay still. They noted every gesture as though intimacy were an official treaty signing. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were universally practiced or reserved for particularly high-profile unions. Some records suggest they were rare, exaggerated by chroniclers eager for salacious detail. Others insist they were standard, just awkward enough to be downplayed in polite retellings. Either way, the idea stuck in cultural memory like a half-forgotten nightmare. And yet, beneath the absurdity, the anxiety was real. Royals lived in constant fear that rivals would challenge the legitimacy of their heirs. Having witnesses was a safeguard, however humiliating. It was like notarizing a kiss, stamping wax seals onto affection. You might joke to yourself, at least nobody pulled out popcorn. But the truth is, this ritual reveals how little of royal marriage belonged to the couple themselves. Their bodies were extensions of the state, and even their most intimate moments became public business. The Queen, lying in the dim light, surely felt the sting of scrutiny most sharply. For her, failure meant disgrace, whispers of barrenness, perhaps annulment. For the King, failure threatened his masculinity, though courtiers were quick to shift blame elsewhere. Both knew the weight of eyes, the weight of dynasty pressing down like the heavy canopy above. You shuffle closer to the fire in this scene, the flames curling like dancers on tired feet. You imagine the nobles finally retreating, their boots clacking on the stone floor, leaving behind a silence almost heavier than their presence. Two royals left to themselves at last, but with the knowledge that their every movement might be reported, dissected, and remembered. The ritual of witnesses seems absurd now, but in that time it was survival. In a world where lineage could spark wars, no detail was too strange if it kept the dynasty intact. And as you think of it, drifting into drowsiness, you realize the strangest truth of all. Love was optional, proof was mandatory. You might not expect it, but the royal chambers smelled less like roses and more like a medieval apothecary. Imagine stepping into a room where the air is heavy with musk, herbs and powders ground by hand, perfumed charms and sticky oils meant to coax fertility from reluctant bodies. To you it feels a little like walking into a spa that doubles as a chemistry experiment gone rogue. The bed is already prepared, sheets sprinkled with rose petals and sometimes even with bits of dried herbs sewn into the seams. On a small side table, vessels of thick, shimmering oils sit beside ivory combs and carved spoons. Courtiers whispered about their supposed powers. One oil warmed the blood, another strengthened the womb, a third ensured male heirs. You lean closer and the scents hit. Clove, cinnamon, frankincense, sometimes mixed with substances you'd rather not identify in polite company. Here's your mainstream fact. Many European courts relied on exotic ingredients imported through trade routes: ambergris from Wales, saffron from the East, nutmeg from Indonesia, because rarity was equated with potency. If it came from across the sea and cost more than a servant's yearly wage, surely it must improve fertility. Historians still argue whether these concoctions had any genuine medical value, or whether they were the medieval equivalent of overpriced miracle supplements. A quirky tidbit slips in here. In Renaissance Italy, powdered unicorn horn was prescribed for everything from impotence to infertility. Of course, no one ever found a unicorn, but narwhal tusks shipped from the Arctic filled the gap nicely. Imagine a king sipping wine laced with grated unicorn dust, confident it would make his bloodline unstoppable. You can't help but smile. Modern health fads don't look so different when you squint. You trace your fingers along the imagined bottles and charms. Perfumed amulets, strung on cords of silk, were sometimes tied around a queen's waist. The idea was simple. Let the fragrance infuse the womb with strength. It's almost poetic, if a little misguided. You picture a nervous young queen clutching at the amulet under her gown, hoping its scent would turn into the sound of a crying infant. The oils weren't always gentle. Some were mixed with aphrodisiacs like Spanish fly, a notorious beetle-based powder that was believed to heat the blood. In reality, it caused blisters, internal bleeding, and sometimes death. Talk about killing the mood. You might joke, nothing says romance like insect poison on the nightstand. But for royals, there was no real choice. The failure to conceive was treated like treason against the dynasty. If oils, perfumes, or charms offered even a flicker of hope, they were used. And if they failed, well, more were prescribed. The court physicians weren't about to admit they had no control over nature. Instead, they doubled down with new recipes, each more elaborate than the last. You linger in this room, listening to the drip of wax from a tall candle, and you realize how much of royal fertility rituals were about control. When bodies refused to comply, people turned to rituals, potions, and perfumes to give the illusion of mastery. Maybe you've felt a version of that yourself, buying that odd vitamin, trying that unproven remedy, just because it feels better to do something than to wait helplessly. Historians still debate how effective these substances really were. Some herbs did carry mild hormonal effects, others were pure nonsense. But the ritual of applying them, the smell of them, the belief in them, all that created a psychological balm for anxious royals. Hope, even in liquid form, was sometimes enough to keep despair at bay. The firelight flickers over polished glass bottles, casting tiny rainbows on the wall. You imagine a king dabbing oil onto his wrists, a queen pressing an amulet to her lips, both whispering silent prayers. The air grows thick with perfume and expectation. And you realize with a sleepy smile that these oils and charms were less about medicine and more about faith. Faith in sense, in touch, in mystery. And faith, even if misplaced, can be a powerful lullaby. You might not expect this, but when the palace corridors fell quiet at midnight, the most important prayers weren't always whispered for victory in battle or protection from plague. They were whispered for babies. Fertility, after all, was as much a spiritual concern as it was a physical one, and so kings and queens turned their anxieties toward altars glowing faintly with candlelight. Imagine it, a stone chapel tucked deep inside the palace, floors cold beneath bare feet, incense curling in the air like ghostly vines. The queen kneels on embroidered cushions, her hands folded tightly, lips moving silently in prayer. The king stands beside her, armoured not in steel but in velvet, looking as nervous as any soldier before battle. The prayer tonight isn't for conquest, it's for conception. Here's the mainstream fact sliding in. Throughout medieval Europe, fertility was often tied to religion. Couples visited shrines dedicated to saints believed to intercede in matters of childbirth. St. Anne in France, for example, or St. Margaret, patroness of safe delivery. Pilgrimages were made, candles were lit, offerings were left. Historians still argue whether these rituals were primarily acts of faith, or whether they doubled as a kind of psychological therapy in an age with limited medical understanding. Now, for a quirky tidbit, in some places women who struggled to conceive were instructed to crawl under the altar during Mass or even slip beneath a saint's reliquary, as if passing under the holy object could transfer fertility. Imagine explaining to your spouse that you've just wriggled under an altar while priests tried to look pious about it. Awkward doesn't even cover it. You step deeper into this imagined chapel. The hush is overwhelming, broken only by the creak of wooden pews and the faint drip of wax. Every prayer feels like a plea sent into the darkness, hoping for a divine reply. And in these moments you realize how entangled royalty was with religion. Fertility wasn't just about continuing the family, it was about proving God's favor upon the dynasty. The anxiety, though, was sharp. If prayers went unanswered, some courtiers whispered that the monarchs were cursed, or worse, that their sins had closed heaven's ear. Blame circled like smoke. The queen might be accused of harboring secret faults, the king might be urged to seek divine forgiveness, even if the issue lay elsewhere. The entire court buzzed with speculation, as though theology were biology. You can almost picture it. A group of ladies-in-waiting lighting 100 candles, their faces glowing gold in the flickering light, each candle representing a whispered hope for a child. The smell of beeswax thickens the air, mingling with prayers that rise like warm air toward the vaulted ceiling. The king, meanwhile, might offer expensive gifts to monasteries, silver chalices, jeweled reliquaries, even lands, hoping generosity would soften heaven's judgment. It's the royal version of slipping a little extra into the collection plate. Historians still debate how sincere these acts were. Some argue the royals truly believed in divine intervention. Others suggest it was political theatre, showing subjects that their rulers were humble enough to pray that they sought divine sanction for their dynasty. Whatever the case, the line between personal faith and public display blurred until you could hardly tell where one ended and the other began. And here's the irony. Sometimes, after years of waiting, a child finally was conceived. Immediately, the successful prayers were credited, recorded in chronicles, and celebrated in feast days. When prayers failed, new saints were consulted, new shrines visited, new rituals invented. The cycle never really ended. You sit now in the corner of this chapel, your head resting against cold stone, watching candle flames tremble in draughts. You can almost hear the hushed tones of monarchs bargaining with heaven. Grant us a child, and we will serve you faithfully. The desperation is palpable, wrapped in incense and whispered devotion. It makes you wonder, as your eyes grow heavy, were these prayers heard, or were they simply echoes meant to soothe restless hearts? Historians may never know, but the quiet sincerity of those midnight rituals lingers in the air, like the faint scent of frankincense, long after the candles have burned out. You might not expect this, but when the priests had finished their blessings and the altars had gone quiet, the business of fertility often slipped into the realm of superstition, and that meant recipes straight out of what we'd call a witch's kitchen today. Imagine the queen's attendants creeping into her chamber with bowls of sticky mixtures, whispering assurances that this time the concoction would bring her children. You step into the room with them. On a table carved with curling vines, jars are scattered, some filled with honey, others with powders and curious clumps of dried matter. A servant lifts the lid off one pot, and the smell is, let's say, not exactly appetizing. Mainstream fact here, across the ancient Mediterranean, from Egypt to Greece to Rome, people experimented with natural contraceptives and fertility boosters. Egyptians, for instance, used mixtures of honey, acacia, and even crocodile dung as a kind of primitive birth control. By the Middle Ages, versions of these recipes still floated around palaces, passed off as fertility enhancers instead of inhibitors. Historians still argue whether the knowledge was misunderstood, deliberately twisted, or just repurposed with desperate hope. And now the quirky tidbit. In medieval England, some believed a woman could boost her fertility by drinking wine infused with powdered rabbit testicles. Yes, rabbit testicles. Supposedly, because rabbits reproduce quickly, their essence would transfer fertility. You can't help but chuckle. Royals were basically taking nutritional advice from Bugs Bunny. You lean closer to the jars, half amused, half appalled. There's a pot of honey, thick as amber, mixed with crushed herbs. Another jar contains ground animal parts, symbols of strength and virility, turned into medicine. One concoction is said to warm the womb, another to steady the humours, yet another to banish cold winds from the belly. And you're left thinking those physicians definitely needed a new marketing team. Still, the rituals were solemn. A queen might drink one potion before lying with her husband, rub another paste onto her wrists, and sleep with charms under her pillow. The servants moved silently, as if breaking the spell with too much noise might undo the magic. You can almost picture the scene, a flicker of firelight, the queen grimacing at the taste of some bitter brew, a handmaiden murmuring encouragement. All the while, the dynasty's fate was tied up in that spoonful of murky liquid. Of course, the results were unreliable at best. Some of these substances were harmless, just herbs and honey. Others were toxic, even fatal. Crocodile dung, for example, was not only ineffective, but also potentially dangerous if infections followed. Spanish fly, a beetle-based aphrodisiac, could inflame the urinary tract, causing excruciating pain. The irony of drinking poison to bring life is a dark joke history never tires of. Historians still debate whether queens believed wholeheartedly in these potions or whether they simply tolerated them to satisfy their physicians, priests, and families. But belief is powerful. When your future depended on a baby, any ritual felt worth trying. Even modern people buy dubious supplements promising miracles, so you can't judge too harshly. The air of the chamber grows thicker as more incense is burned, trying to mask the less pleasant odours. Beeswax candles drip onto silver plates, and the queen, weary but obedient, drinks what she is given. She lies back on the perfumed pillows, clutching a charm sewn with tiny bones or herbs. Hope hums in the silence like a faint, restless wind. You find yourself smiling wryly. Royals may have lived in gilded palaces, but when it came to fertility, they relied on the same desperate, messy, and sometimes ridiculous remedies as commoners, just with more expensive containers. And as you drift here, watching shadows curl across the walls, you realize how fragile even the most powerful people were. Their crowns glittered, their armies marched, but inside their private chambers they placed their trust in honey, herbs, and crocodile dung. You might not expect this, but in the dim glow of palace chambers, the most powerful people in the realm often put their hopes not in gods or charms, but in the steady hands of physicians. Royal doctors, summoned in silken robes, carried leather satchels filled with scrolls, herbs, and instruments that looked more like torture devices than medical tools. And there, in the hush of the royal bedchamber, they offered advice that could determine the fate of kingdoms. Picture it. The king pacing before a carved oak fireplace, jaw clenched, while the physician, perhaps with a beard that made him look wiser than he truly was, speaks of humours and balance. Too much cold in the womb, he declares, or too much heat in the blood. And suddenly a marriage is reduced to alchemy and guesswork. Here's your mainstream fact. Medieval and Renaissance physicians followed Galenic theory, which claimed health depended on balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Fertility, in their eyes, was no different. If a woman failed to conceive, perhaps her womb was too dry or her husband's seed too cold. Treatments involved diets, bleeding, and strange tonics. Historians still argue whether this framework was genuine science for its time or just elaborate storytelling wrapped in Latin. And here's a quirky tidbit. In Tudor England, one fertility treatment involved placing roasted pig testicles against the skin, believing their warmth and essence could invigorate the reproductive organs. Imagine the poor queen lying politely as still while the physician announces, "Just a little longer, Your Majesty. The pork is working." It's enough to make you grateful for modern medicine. You glance around this imagined chamber, where the doctor scribbles notes with quill and ink, recording every detail. When the queen's courses began, how the king appeared after banquets, whether the stars seemed favourable. Royal physicians became not only healers but also spies, their reports shaping how the court judged the couple's private life. The irony is sharp. Kings commanded armies, but here they were told to avoid certain foods or to time their intimacy with lunar cycles. A monarch who defeated rebellions might still be instructed with all seriousness to drink warm goat's milk before bed. You smile at the absurdity. Power doesn't make you immune to bad advice. Of course, the physicians weren't entirely charlatans. Some herbs, like rue or pennyroyal, had real effects on the body, though often dangerously so. Others, like sage or pomegranate, did provide nutrients. But the line between helpful remedy and harmful superstition was thin, and when the pressure was royal, physicians rarely admitted ignorance. Better to prescribe anything, than to shrug. You watch the doctor bow deeply, his advice given, his satchel packed once more. He leaves behind a trail of incense and unease. The king rubs his temples, muttering about dynasties. The queen sits in silence, fingers twisting the edge of her gown. Neither truly believes the pig testicle treatment will save them, but hope is stubborn, and when you're a monarch, even the absurd can feel worth trying. Historians still debate the role of these physicians. Were they trusted experts or merely elaborate props in the theatre of fertility? In truth, they were both. Their presence gave the illusion of control, a script to follow when nature refused to obey. And illusions in politics can be as valuable as facts. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the smoky air settle, and you realize that royal physicians lived in shadowed chambers, caught between medicine and myth. They soothed monarchs, protected reputations, and sometimes prescribed poison with a straight face. And in the end, perhaps their greatest skill wasn't healing bodies, but calming fears, reminding kings and queens that they weren't powerless, even when the cradle stayed empty. You might not expect this, but when the cradle stayed empty, the blame rarely landed evenly. In the golden halls of Europe's palaces, a barren marriage was rarely called the king's fault. No, the whispers circled the queen like vultures, her reputation picked apart until she was seen as little more than a failed vessel. Imagine it. The queen walks through the palace gardens, embroidered gown brushing against lavender, her ladies trailing behind in silence. Every bow from a courtier feels heavy, tinged with judgment. They smile, but their eyes flicker toward her waistline, measuring what isn't there. In a world where her worth was tied to her womb, absence spoke louder than presence. Here's the mainstream fact. Throughout history, infertility was overwhelmingly blamed on women. In Tudor England, for example, Catherine of Aragon endured relentless accusations when she failed to produce a surviving son with Henry VIII, though medical historians today suspect Henry himself may have carried a genetic condition. Historians still argue whether monarchs truly believed their queens were at fault, or whether blaming women was simply more politically convenient. Now the quirky tidbit: in 16th century France, some courtiers claimed that infertility in queens was caused by them wearing shoes with heels too high, supposedly tilting the womb out of place. Yes, apparently stilettos were sabotaging dynasties long before they sabotaged ankles at weddings. You picture the queen in her chamber, listening to these rumors, knowing her fate rested on something she couldn't control. If a pregnancy failed, it was whispered she had sinned. If she miscarried, it was whispered she was cursed. The king might still command loyalty, but her own status teetered on a knife's edge. Kings, of course, weren't entirely free of anxiety. If heirs didn't appear, their masculinity was questioned in secret. But public blame? That was directed elsewhere. A monarch couldn't be seen as weak. To preserve his authority, the narrative bent toward his wife. The dynasty was sacred, and someone had to carry the weight of its failures. You step into a great hall, chandeliers glittering above, courtiers murmuring beneath. Gossip spreads here faster than wildfire. "The queen is barren," someone mutters. "Perhaps the king should remarry," another suggests. The queen isn't present, but she feels it all the same. Silence at the royal table could wound deeper than words, and sometimes the consequences were brutal. Queens who failed to conceive could be set aside, exiled, or replaced. Political marriages weren't about love, they were contracts for heirs. If one partner failed, the contract could be annulled. You can almost hear the parchment tearing, the ink drying on a new marriage treaty, the queen's name erased as though she had never existed. Yet even in her disgrace she might still cling to rituals. Prayers whispered into pillows, oils dabbed on her wrists, saints petitioned in desperate vigils. Hope is a stubborn thing, even when history tilts against you. Historians still argue whether queens themselves internalized the blame or whether they quietly recognized the injustice. What's certain is that their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, biology, politics, superstition, all converging on their bodies like a storm. You lean against the cold stone wall of this imagined palace, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down. The irony, of course, is that half the time the problem might have been the king himself. Low fertility, illnesses, or even impotence, none of it was admitted. Better to call a queen barren than to expose the fragility of the crown. The garden beyond the hall glows faintly in the moonlight, and you imagine the queen walking there, alone, her footsteps soft on the gravel. She pauses by a fountain, listening to the water's endless trickle. In the sound, she hears her own prayers, quiet, desperate, and unanswered. And you realize with a heavy sigh that royal fertility was never just about nature. It was about blame, power, and the cruel convenience of silence. You might not expect this, but behind the gilded walls and beneath the solemn portraits, royal lineages were often less tidy than official chronicles suggested. When a queen couldn't conceive, or when a king's patience ran thin, there was another path, one whispered about in corridors and hidden in nursery cradles. Illegitimate children. Imagine the scene, a banquet hall roaring with music and laughter. The king raises his goblet, his queen seated stiffly beside him. Yet across the room his eyes linger on a lady in waiting, or perhaps on a foreign court beauty whose smile lingers a little too long. Later, in shadowed corridors, footsteps echo as secrets are sown, and before long, whispers rise, there is a child. Here's the mainstream fact. Kings across Europe were notorious for fathering illegitimate children. Charles II of England acknowledged over a dozen. Louis XIV of France had so many mistresses and offspring that courtiers joked the Sun King cast shadows everywhere he went. Historians still argue whether these illegitimate children weakened dynasties by causing rival claims, or whether they strengthened the king's aura of virility in an age obsessed with heirs. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some monarchs disguised their illegitimate children as wards of the crown or adopted courtiers, raising them in the palace with all the privileges of nobility. In some cases, they were given playful titles like the King's Sparrow or Little Duke. Imagine the awkward family dinner. Your father is the king, your stepmother is the queen. And no one mentions the obvious. You step into an imagined nursery lit by a single candle. A child sleeps in a carved cradle, its sides adorned with the royal crest. Officially, this child doesn't exist. Unofficially, everyone knows who the father is. The queen, lying awake in her separate chamber, hears the same rumors, feels the same sting. Her own womb is empty, yet her husband's mistresses are filling the palace with reminders of her failure. And yet dynasties sometimes leaned on these shadows. When heirs failed to appear, illegitimate children were quietly groomed for power. Some rose to high positions in the army or the church, wielding influence just shy of the throne. It was a dangerous balancing act, acknowledge them too openly, and succession laws grew muddy. Ignore them, and resentment brewed in the wings. You might chuckle at the irony. The kingdom obsessed over legitimate heirs, yet half the royal bloodline seemed to be running around off the record. Court gossips thrived on it. Who looked like the king? Who mysteriously received expensive gifts? Servants noted every resemblance, every favour. But for queens, this shadow lineage was cruel. Their worth was tied to producing heirs, and each illegitimate child born elsewhere was like salt in the wound. You imagine Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II, who endured a marriage full of mistresses yet never produced a child herself. She must have felt like a ghost in her own palace, watching a parade of rivals take her place in the king's private life. Historians still debate how much power these illegitimate lines truly held. Some faded into obscurity, erased by careful chroniclers. Others, like the Beaufort family descended from John of Gaunt, became powerful enough to influence future thrones. Royal blood, after all, has a way of finding its path forward, even when unwelcome. In the candlelit silence of this imagined palace, you lean against the doorway, watching a child breathe softly in sleep. Its future is uncertain, its existence both dangerous and precious. In that tiny chest rising and falling, you glimpse the fragile truth. Dynasties could be both broken and sustained by children who were never supposed to exist. And you realize, as your own breath slows with the rhythm of the cradle's rocking, that legitimacy was less about love or blood and more about politics. And politics, like shadows, stretches wherever power burns brightest. You might not expect this, but when medicine and midwives failed, the royal gaze turned skyward. For centuries, the stars weren't just pretty dots scattered across velvet nights. They were read as instruction manuals for life itself, especially for conception. In the quiet courtyards of palaces, astrologers stood with parchment charts, compasses, and a confidence that could make or break dynasties. Picture it, the king and queen seated in a candlelit study, nervously waiting while a robed astrologer consults his instruments. He traces the curve of Saturn, notes the stubborn position of Mars, and finally declares, "Tonight is auspicious. The child conceived now shall be strong." Or worse, "No union tonight. Venus is dark, and the womb will resist." Imagine your intimate life scheduled by planetary weather reports. Here's your mainstream fact. Astrology guided royal decision-making for centuries. Queen Elizabeth I of England famously consulted astrologer John Dee for political and personal advice, while Catherine de' Medici in France kept court astrologers practically on retainer. Historians still argue whether monarchs genuinely believed the stars dictated fertility or whether they used astrology as a convenient excuse for failures beyond their control. Now, for a quirky tidbit, in some royal courts, astrologers even calculated which hour of the night offered the best seed-planting moment. Not just the day, not just the moon phase, the exact hour. Imagine the pressure. "Sorry, darling, Jupiter doesn't favour 11:15, let's wait until 1:07. You can't help but laugh at how intimacy became a cosmic appointment. You wander outside into the imagined palace garden. The sky is clear, and the astrologer lifts his arm, pointing to constellations etched against the black. "This star favours daughters," he whispers. "That one, sons." The queen tilts her head upward, torn between awe and despair, because the heavens themselves seem to dictate her body's fate. Astrology wasn't just personal, it was public theatre. When a royal birth was announced, astrologers quickly spun charts, claiming they had predicted the child's arrival. If the queen miscarried, they murmured that Saturn had been ill-aspected. You notice the trick. Success was always proof of their wisdom. Failure was always the fault of the stars. No refunds offered. The irony, of course, is that the same stars look down on everyone, the peasant ploughing fields, the merchant stacking wares. But in royal palaces, those stars weighed more heavily, as if Orion himself carried the burden of dynastic succession on his shoulders. Historians still debate whether astrologers truly believed their craft or simply played roles demanded by the powerful. Some charts were astonishingly detailed, filled with precise calculations. Others were vague enough to cover every possibility. In a way, astrology was less about the heavens and more about comfort, giving monarchs a sense that fate had a map, that chaos could be read and tamed. You pause, listening to the night insects buzz faintly in the hedges of the palace garden. The astrologer folds his charts, tucks his quills away, and departs with a bow. The king sighs, relieved or worried, depending on the verdict. The queen stares up at the moon, wondering if its pale glow favors her tonight. And you can't help but smile at the absurdity and the beauty of it. For all their wealth and power, monarchs lay awake under the same stars you see now. They searched the heavens for answers, just as people still check horoscopes today. Only difference? For them, the stakes weren't a bad date or a lucky day, they were the rise or fall of empires. You might not expect this, but in the endless bookkeeping of royal households, there was one ledger more closely guarded than taxes or treaties: the Queen's cycle. Every month was tracked, whispered about, and prayed over as though it were a royal decree waiting to be signed. Servants, midwives, and physicians turned the Queen's body into a calendar, each day carefully tallied, as if ink and quills could coax an heir into existence. Imagine the scene: a quiet chamber, its windows shuttered against the night. A lady in waiting dips her quill into ink, marking a tiny symbol in the margin of a leather-bound book. She records the dates of the Queen's courses, the days when her complexion brightened, the moments when she seemed restless or tired. This journal is no diary of feelings. It's a fertility chart, centuries before apps ever existed. Here's your mainstream fact: medieval and Renaissance medicine taught that women were most fertile immediately after their courses, as menstruation was called. Physicians advised timing intimacy in those days, believing the womb was cleansed and ready. Historians still argue whether this was a lucky guess that sometimes worked, or whether it was pure medical folklore passed down without proof. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some courts, midwives were ordered to check the Queen's undergarments daily, then deliver written reports to court officials. Yes, imagine having your laundry inspected like royal mail. Privacy was not part of the package when your womb was considered a state asset. You walk through an imagined corridor lit by torchlight, hearing the scratch of quills in chambers beyond. Each scratch is a calculation, a prediction, a silent judgment. The Queen's courses are late, one servant mutters. Perhaps she is with child. But the palace has learned to temper hope. Too many false alarms, too many tears. The Queen herself feels the weight of these records. Every twinge in her belly, every delay, becomes a matter of gossip. She cannot sneeze without someone wondering if it signals pregnancy. You picture her at her embroidery frame, smiling politely, while the ladies beside her whisper about dates and possibilities. Kings, of course, were informed of the charts. They were told which nights were favourable, which days to avoid. Imagine the romance-killing announcement from a physician. Your Majesty, tonight the moon and the charts align. It is the proper time. Nothing kills spontaneity faster than an appointment card for intimacy. Historians still debate how accurate these records were, but what's clear is that they turned the Queen's body into a public schedule. Failure to conceive wasn't just her private sorrow. It was an event marked in ink, preserved in archives, and whispered about in corridors for generations. And yet you can't help but notice the absurdity. These careful charts and calculations were, in their own way, a desperate attempt at control. In a world where death, disease, and famine struck without warning, royals clung to the illusion that if they counted carefully enough, they could bend fate to their will. You pause by a flickering candelabrum, hearing the drip of wax and the faint murmur of servants beyond the door. The Queen's chamber is still, but outside, the machinery of record-keeping grinds on. Pages turn, quills scratch, candles burn low, all in service of a single hope: a child who may or may not come. And you realize as your breath slows that these monthly rituals weren't just about science or superstition. They were about the human need to believe that careful attention, days counted, notes kept, cycles watched, might somehow coax life into being. It was bookkeeping as prayer, numbers as hope, ink as a lullaby written against the silence of an empty cradle. You might not expect this, but hidden beneath silks and jewels, many royals carried small, clinking secrets. Charms, amulets, and talismans were sewn into sleeves, tucked into bodices, or hidden under pillows, as if a scrap of bone or a bead of glass could coax the heavens into granting an heir. In a palace where everything was theatre, these quiet objects became props in the most personal performance of all. Picture a queen dressing for a feast. The ladies in waiting lace her gown tightly, smoothing embroidered velvet over her shoulders. They chatter about fabrics, jewels, and court gossip. But beneath the sleeve, a tiny charm sewn into the lining rattles softly. Perhaps it is a carved ivory figurine, a saint's relic wrapped in cloth, or even a coin stamped with astrological symbols. No one comments, but everyone notices. It's just another layer of the costume called royalty. Here's the mainstream fact: talismans were widely used in medieval and Renaissance Europe, even among the highly educated. Monarchs commissioned elaborate charms, sometimes inscribed with biblical verses, sometimes with zodiacal signs, believed to protect fertility. Historians still argue whether these objects were taken seriously as medicine, or simply served as psychological crutches in moments of desperation. And the quirky tidbit: some amulets were shockingly strange. In parts of France, women were advised to carry the dried left testicle of a weasel tied in a little pouch as a fertility charm. Imagine sitting through a royal banquet, goblet of wine in hand, all the while knowing there's a rodent's relic stitched into your sleeve. Fashion statement? Not quite. The palace corridors echoed with these quiet secrets. Priests might bless a talisman, physicians might frown at it, and courtiers might mock it behind fans, but queens clung to them all the same. Because when prayers and potions failed, sometimes hope came in the form of a lump sewn into silk. You lean against the doorway of an imagined chamber, watching the queen at prayer. She touches her sleeve lightly, almost unconsciously, where the charm is hidden. Her lips move in silence, but her fingers linger on the spot, as if reassurance lies in both prayer and pouch. Of course, charms weren't limited to queens. Kings too wore amulets, rings set with stones thought to spark virility, belts embroidered with fertility symbols, even tiny satchels worn close to the chest. A monarch might command armies, but he still clutched at charms like any anxious husband hoping for a child. The irony doesn't escape you. Here were the most powerful people in the world, sitting on thrones of gold, ruling lands with armies at their beck and call, yet relying on talismans no different from those sold in a village market. Power on the outside, superstition stitched quietly inside. Historians still debate how effective these charms were considered to be. Some argue that their use was symbolic, a way of showing devotion or aligning with tradition. Others believe monarchs genuinely trusted them, clinging to talismans as lifelines when their futures hung in the balance. You wander further into the chamber, hearing the rustle of silk, the soft clink of beads sewn into hems. The firelight gleams off metal charms, dull from handling, warm from skin. They are intimate objects worn close, hidden beneath layers of grandeur. And you realize, as your own eyes grow heavy, that these talismans were less about superstition and more about comfort. They were whispers of control in a world that offered none, little anchors of hope in a sea of uncertainty. The sound of the weasel's testicle pouch or the saint's relic brushing against silk was not just odd, it was reassurance, sewn into every step. You might not expect this, but royal bathtubs weren't just for soaking away the aches of heavy crowns. They became miniature temples of fertility, filled not only with warm water, but with strange brews of milk, herbs, and exotic ingredients meant to invite new life into the royal womb. Imagine stepping into a steaming marble bath, the surface shimmering with petals and oils, while anxious attendants whisper prayers and instructions like stage directions. You follow the scene. The bath itself is carved from a single block of stone, veined with colors that catch candlelight. Servants pour in jugs of milk until the water turns opaque and creamy. Into this they sprinkle sprigs of rosemary, sage, and thyme, each believed to stir life within the body. The queen lowers herself into the warmth, the liquid clinging to her skin like a second robe. Around her, the scent is sweet but sharp, a mixture of flowers and medicine. Here's your mainstream fact: ritual baths for fertility have roots in antiquity. Roman women bathed in mixtures of herbs thought to purify the womb, and these traditions carried into medieval courts, where queens were prescribed milk baths with specific plants tied to humoral theory. Historians still argue whether these were genuine medical practices, symbolic gestures, or simply ways to soothe royal nerves with luxury. Now the quirky tidbit: in Renaissance France, some queens were advised to bathe in wine, yes, literal red wine, believing it would warm the blood and encourage conception. Picture a royal bathtub sloshing with Bordeaux, courtiers wrinkling their noses at the smell, and the poor laundress stuck scrubbing grape stains from towels afterward. Talk about a waste of vintage. You lean closer to the imagined bath, hearing the soft splash as attendants ladle scented water over the queen's shoulders. They murmur charms under their breath, sometimes reciting psalms, sometimes ancient rhymes passed down through midwives. Every gesture carries the weight of hope. The bath isn't simply cleansing, it's a ritual of rebirth, a liquid prayer poured over skin. Kings, too, sometimes participated. Records tell of rulers instructed to bathe in certain mineral waters or to soak in tubs infused with musk and ginger, believed to enhance virility. You can almost see a grumpy monarch sulking in his wine-scented bath, muttering, "This had better work." The rituals were layered with symbolism. Water was life, milk was nourishment, herbs were protection. Together they formed a kind of liquid incantation. And for a royal couple under relentless pressure, even slipping into a steaming bath became a political act. Success meant dynastic survival, failure meant scandal, annulment, or worse. Historians still debate whether these baths did anything beyond relaxation. Perhaps they eased tension, lowered stress, and in turn made conception more likely. Or perhaps they were pure placebo, convincing anxious monarchs that at least something was being done. Either way, the act mattered, even if the science didn't. You sit in the corner of the chamber, listening to the dripping of water, the hushed voices of attendants, the rustle of silk towels. The queen leans back, eyes closed, her body floating weightless for once. For a brief moment, she feels free of the heavy crown, free of the whispers, free of the judgment. In the steam there is only warmth, fragrance, and the faint illusion of control. And you realize, as your own breath slows in rhythm with the ripples, that these royal baths were more than strange recipes. They were sanctuaries where hope dissolved into water, where dynasties sought renewal in every drop. And whether or not they worked, they left behind the soothing image of queens, cradled in warm milk and herbs, dreaming of heirs yet unborn. You might not expect this, but when baths of milk and herbs failed, some rituals crossed into darker, more unsettling territory. Rites where the line between sacred sacrifice and symbolic blood blurred like candle smoke. Royals desperate for heirs sometimes turned to ceremonies that looked more like offerings to ancient gods than prayers to saints, and the echoes of those rituals still haunt the palaces they once filled. Picture a midnight chamber, lit only by red wax candles. The queen kneels on a cushion before an altar draped in cloth embroidered with suns and moons. In front of her sits a bowl filled with wine, herbs, and, whisper it, drops of animal blood. Priests chant in low tones, their voices rising and falling like waves. Each phrase promises that this mixture will awaken fertility, as if life could be bribed into existence with tokens of sacrifice. Here's your mainstream fact. In early modern Europe, animal sacrifice was not unheard of in folk practices tied to fertility. Sheep's blood or the heart of a dove might be offered, either literally or symbolically, to strengthen the womb or appease divine forces. Historians still argue whether these practices filtered into royal courts through superstition, or whether they were exaggerated rumors used to discredit queens who failed to conceive. And now, the quirky tidbit: in some parts of Renaissance Italy, couples desperate for children were advised to drink a concoction made from rooster blood mixed with wine, believing the rooster's famed virility could transfer into human form. Imagine a court physician pouring goblets of crimson liquid, solemnly insisting, "Bottoms up, your majesties." Romantic dinner ruined. You hover in this imagined room, uneasy yet fascinated. The king stands nearby, his hands clasped, his face pale in the glow. He wants an heir, but the sight of blood unsettles him. The queen drinks, her eyes closed, her lips stained dark. Around them, attendants keep silent, pretending this is holy rather than horrifying. Of course, not all rituals spilled real blood. Sometimes the symbolism was enough. A lamb's heart pressed briefly to the queen's chest, or crimson wine poured over an altar to stand in for sacrifice. These gestures carried the weight of both Christian and older pagan traditions, because when dynasties faced extinction, rulers reached for anything, no matter how contradictory. Historians still debate how widespread these practices were. Some chronicles dismiss them as slander, scandalous rumors spread by political enemies. Others suggest that private rituals, blending folk magic and religion, truly did take place in the hidden chambers of palaces. The truth may never be fully known, but the whispers cling to history like stains on silk. You can almost hear the echoes, the low chant of priests, the drip of wax, the sharp tang of iron in the air. For the royal couple, the ritual is not just about faith, it is about desperation. They would risk ridicule, disgust, even damnation if only the cradle in the nursery might finally be filled. And the cruel irony. These rituals rarely worked. The queen might miscarry, the king might fall ill. The blood, the prayers, the secrecy, all for nothing. Yet hope is stubborn, and failure only fueled more rituals, more sacrifices, more desperate bargains with the unseen. You lean against the stone wall of the imagined chamber, shivering slightly, not from cold, but from the strangeness of it all. In palaces filled with art and music, these darker ceremonies flickered in secret, hidden from the gilded halls. And as your breath slows, you realize that royal fertility was never only about life. It was also about fear. Fear so sharp it drove monarchs into rituals that mingled faith with shadows, creating scenes as haunting as they were heartbreaking. You might not expect this, but sometimes the sharpest blade in a palace wasn't a dagger hidden in a sleeve, it was gossip. For royals struggling with fertility, the cruelest rituals didn't take place in chapels or bedchambers. They unfolded in the great halls, whispered in galleries, and fluttered behind lace fans where courtiers sharpened words into weapons. Imagine it, a glittering banquet, tables groaning with roasted peacocks, candied fruits, and silver goblets of spiced wine. The queen lifts her glass, smiling graciously. Across the table, a duke leans toward his neighbor and mutters, just loudly enough to be overheard, "Perhaps the crown should already be considering other options." A ripple of suppressed laughter passes down the row, disguised as coughing. The queen feels it like a knife at her ribs. Here's your mainstream fact. Courts were hives of rumor, and infertility was one of the most dangerous subjects of gossip. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and countless others endured whispered accusations that undermined their standing long before official dismissals. Historians still argue whether gossip simply reflected political realities or whether it actively drove kings to act. Now for a quirky tidbit. In 17th century France, pamphlets were sometimes circulated mocking royal couples who had not produced heirs. These weren't polite essays, they were bawdy, satirical cartoons, sometimes printed anonymously, showing caricatures of kings and queens as barren trees or broken fountains. Imagine seeing your private grief turned into an early form of tabloid meme. You wander through the imagined gallery of a palace, hearing the hissing murmur of courtiers. She looks pale, perhaps another miscarriage. He spends too much time hunting, perhaps the problem lies with him. The gossip travels faster than any official message, carried on the currents of vanity, envy, and ambition. For courtiers eager to climb the social ladder, a whispered rumour could be as useful as a drawn sword. And the royals? They had to smile through it all. Queens painted their lips redder, wore gowns with padded stomachs, or arranged audiences with midwives to prove rumours false. Kings thundered at the slander, but the more they denied, the more people whispered. You can almost feel the claustrophobia, every gesture scrutinized, every absence noted, every cough or fainting spell spun into speculation. Historians still debate the power of this gossip. Some argue it was merely background noise in courts already driven by politics. Others suggest it shaped decisions, fanned tensions, and sometimes tipped monarchs toward divorces, annulments, or new marriages. After all, even kings feared being mocked as failures. You pause in this imagined great hall, gazing up at chandeliers heavy with dripping wax. The Queen sits at the far end, her smile polished to perfection, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She knows the whispers. She feels them ripple like cold draughts across her skin. She lifts her goblet anyway, playing the role of serene sovereign while the room hums with quiet cruelty. It's a peculiar kind of ritual, this gossip, less formal than a fertility charm, but no less powerful. Words could erode reputations, marriages, and even thrones. A courtier didn't need to draw blood to wound. A half-spoken joke was enough. You find yourself almost chuckling at the modern parallels. Back then it was whispered gossip in candlelit halls. Today it's tabloids and comment sections. Different tools, same sharpness. People still find strange delight in questioning the private lives of the powerful. As you drift here, listening to the imagined buzz of courtly voices, you realize that gossip itself was a fertility ritual, an ugly, public one. It created pressure, fear, and performance, driving royals to try harder, pray longer, drink stranger concoctions. And sometimes it was the gossip, not the infertility, that finally broke them. You might not expect this, but when gossip grew too sharp and the cradle stayed empty, kings often decided to take a shortcut. Mistresses. At court, affairs weren't always about passion or secret romance. They were often justified as duty. If the queen couldn't provide heirs, then perhaps someone else could. And with dynasties on the line, mistresses became more than companions. They were unofficial players in the survival of kingdoms. Imagine a royal bedchamber, its walls hung with heavy brocade. The king sits brooding by the fire, crown tossed aside, goblet of wine half empty. The queen lies silent in her adjoining room, her prayers unanswered. Into this silence steps another figure, a lady-in-waiting, or perhaps a noblewoman whose family is eager for favour. The king doesn't need to explain. Everyone already understands the script. Here's your mainstream fact. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, fathered at least 15 illegitimate children through various mistresses, many of whom were later legitimized and granted titles. Likewise, Henry II of England's famous affair with Rosamund Clifford was framed not just as romance, but as an almost political inevitability when his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine strained. Historians still argue whether kings sought mistresses for love or strategy, but either way, fertility was always in the background. And now, for the quirky tidbit, some monarchs actually kept official titles for their mistresses. In 16th century France, the maîtresse en titre, chief mistress, was recognized as a semi-official court position, complete with apartments in the palace. Imagine having your lover's name show up on the payroll. Awkward HR conversation, to say the least. You wander into this imagined court, hearing the rustle of silk and the laughter of courtiers. Mistresses are everywhere, beautiful, witty, politically ambitious. Some wield more influence than ministers. A queen watches silently, forced to maintain dignity while her rival parades down the corridor in jewels gifted by the king. For the queen, every gift to a mistress is a reminder of what she has failed to give. A son, The king, meanwhile, enjoys the illusion of control. If the queen's womb refuses, perhaps another's will not. And if an illegitimate child is born, he may not inherit the throne, but he becomes proof that the king is virile. The problem then is not with the monarch, but with the queen. Convenient, isn't it? You can almost hear the gossip spreading like wildfire. The king visits her chambers nightly. A child is expected. These whispers shift the power balance of the court. Families of mistresses rise in influence, queens grow isolated, and dynasties stumble into dangerous territory. For while mistresses might soothe egos, they also sow resentment and instability. Historians still debate the role of these affairs. Were they safety valves for frustrated kings, or political strategies to test fertility outside the queen's bed? Perhaps both. What's certain is that mistresses shaped history as much as queens did, sometimes steering policy through whispered words on a pillow. The irony, of course, is sharp. Kings crowned with divine right commanding armies still scrambled for proof of potency like nervous schoolboys, and when legitimate heirs didn't appear, they turned to mistresses not just for comfort, but for validation. Tiny bundles of proof cradled in silk-lined cribs. You pause in this imagined palace hallway, lit by flickering torches. The queen passes, her expression regal but her eyes shadowed. Behind her, laughter rises from the mistress's chamber. The walls themselves seem to lean inward, storing up secrets, pressing them into the stone. And you realize with a sigh that royal mistresses weren't simply lovers. They were instruments of dynasty, pawns in the endless anxious game of heirs and survival. For every queen broken by gossip, there was a mistress elevated by the same whispers, and between them both, the weight of the crown pressed down harder than ever. You might not expect this, but when all else failed, when potions turned sour, when mistresses complicated matters, when gossip bruised reputations, royal women often turned their hopes toward the saints. Palaces that once rang with music and feasts now echoed with the soft footsteps of queens making pilgrimages to chapels, clutching relics in trembling hands, whispering prayers into the cool stone silence. Picture it, the queen in a velvet cloak, hood drawn low, slipping into a candle-lit chapel at dawn. She kneels before a relic, perhaps a bone of St. Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, or a fragment of St. Anne's veil. Her lips move in prayer, words spilling faster as tears threaten. Around her, incense curls upward, blending her voice into the murmured chants of monks. For a moment, her crown vanishes. She is only a woman begging for a child. Here's your mainstream fact. Royal women often made pilgrimages to holy shrines associated with fertility and childbirth. In France, the shrine of St. Anne d'Auray drew countless noble supplicants. In England, women prayed to St. Margaret of Antioch, even carrying small images of her into their birthing chambers. Historians still argue whether these acts were motivated by genuine devotion or by the political need to be seen seeking divine approval. Now for the quirky tidbit, some queens even sent offerings of tiny wax infants to shrines, shaped like the children they prayed to receive. Monks and priests sometimes displayed entire walls of these wax babies, hanging in chapels like a gallery of hope and despair. Imagine walking into a room filled with hundreds of silent, candlelit wax dolls, both touching and eerie. You wander into such a chapel in your mind. The air smells of damp stone and melted wax. The queen presses her forehead to the reliquary glass, leaving a faint smudge. Behind her, her attendants shift uncomfortably, aware that the success of this prayer could determine their own futures too. Everyone in the room knows if she conceives, the court will rejoice. If she fails, the whispers will sharpen. Sometimes entire processions were arranged. Queens were paraded to holy wells, instructed to bathe in waters blessed by saints. Others were told to fast, to walk barefoot around shrines, to leave behind jewels as offerings. A queen's desperation was measured not only in tears, but in treasures abandoned at altars. And yet these acts also provided comfort. To kneel before a saint, to light a candle in the darkness, was to place hope in something beyond human control. When physicians, midwives, and mistresses failed, faith remained. Even skeptics might admit sometimes, after years of childlessness, a queen conceived soon after a pilgrimage. Was it chance? Was it faith? Historians still argue whether such events were coincidence, divine intervention, or the natural odds finally turning in their favour. You lean against the chapel doorway, watching the queen rise from her knees, her eyes red but her posture regal. She turns to leave, her footsteps echoing across stone, her gown brushing the floor like a sigh. Behind her, candles flicker, their flames steady even as her hope trembles. And you realize, as the incense lingers in the air, that these pilgrimages were less about saints and more about survival. They were rituals of surrender, moments when queens admitted, even silently, that crowns and castles meant nothing without the cry of a child. The image fades slowly. A lonely figure in a dark chapel, head bowed, praying into the silence of history. You might not expect this, but behind every curtain of royal ceremony, there were always women who knew far more than they were supposed to, the midwives. They moved through palaces with quiet authority, called upon in hushed tones, trusted with secrets that even kings and bishops never dared to speak aloud. While court physicians blustered about humours and stars, midwives whispered practical truths in the dark corners of royal chambers. Imagine it, the queen reclines in a velvet chair, pale and weary, after another failed attempt at pregnancy. The physician has left, having muttered something about imbalances and prescribed yet another bitter tonic. Then in slips the midwife, older, calmer, with hands worn from years of catching babies and comforting mothers. She kneels beside the queen, adjusts her shawl, and whispers advice too earthy, too real, to ever be written in the court's official records. Here's your mainstream fact. Midwives were central figures in medieval and Renaissance childbirth, often wielding more practical knowledge than university-trained doctors. Their experience came from observation, not theory, and royal courts relied heavily on them during pregnancies. Historians still argue whether their advice was systematically ignored by male physicians or quietly respected behind closed doors. Now, for the quirky tidbit, some midwives swore by charms like tying knots in red string or placing a piece of iron under the bed to ward off evil spirits that could block conception. It sounds superstitious, but queens often clung to these rituals with the same seriousness they gave to a physician's Latin diagnosis. After all, both promised hope, and sometimes the midwife's tricks worked better. You linger in this imagined chamber, watching the queen grip the midwife's hand. The midwife leans closer, voice soft. "Eat more lentils, Your Majesty. Rest after the new moon, and don't let them bleed you again. It weakens the womb." Her words are simple, pragmatic, delivered with confidence born of decades in smoky kitchens and cramped birthing rooms far from marble halls. Kings distrusted midwives, of course. Their influence was threatening. Here were women without noble titles, without degrees, holding knowledge that could topple dynasties if mishandled. Yet when labour began, it was the midwives, not the physicians, who were called first. You can almost hear the rush of footsteps down palace corridors, the urgent cry, "Fetch the midwife!" And they came, bringing their bags of herbs, cloths, oils, and whispered prayers. They knew how to turn a breech baby, how to ease pain with heated stones, how to coax a reluctant womb. In the most desperate hours, they were guardians of hope, even if their names rarely made it into official chronicles. Historians still debate how much power these women truly wielded. Some argue they were marginalized, dismissed as superstitious. Others suggest they were indispensable, their quiet advice shaping the most private choices of queens and kings alike. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the candle-lit shadows. You picture the midwife leaving the chamber, her footsteps muffled on the stone floor, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. Behind her, the queen lies calmer, reassured in a way no physician's lecture ever managed. It's not that the midwife had all the answers, it's that she offered something rarer in palaces obsessed with heirs, compassion. And you realize, as the corridor grows darker, that midwives carried more than herbs and charms. They carried trust, whispered secrets, and the quiet authority of women who had seen life and death with their own eyes. In a world where fertility was tangled in ritual, politics, and superstition, they provided something simpler, the comforting truth that the queen was not alone. You might not expect this, but in the great game of heirs and dynasties, even childbirth itself was rarely private for queens. When the long-awaited day arrived, the palace didn't hush in respect. It filled with spectators. Royal births were treated less like tender beginnings and more like public ceremonies, staged to reassure everyone that no tricks had been played. Imagine it, the queen in labour, sweat dampening her temples, gripping the carved wood of her bed. Her chamber, rather than quiet and intimate, is crowded with noble women, courtiers, and sometimes even ambassadors. They aren't there to help, they're there to watch. Their job? To ensure that the child delivered was truly hers and not swapped by scheming midwives or enemies. Privacy in this world was a luxury queens simply could not afford. Here's your mainstream fact. In 17th and 18th century France, royal births were often witnessed by large audiences. When Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child in 1778, over 200 people packed into her chamber, jostling for a glimpse. Some fainted in the crush. Historians still argue whether this practice was intended to protect dynasties from rumour or whether it had become an entrenched spectacle of court culture. Now for the quirky tidbit. In Spain, one Habsburg queen reportedly gave birth behind a transparent curtain so courtiers could see her silhouette but not her agony. The compromise was meant to preserve both modesty and legitimacy. Imagine labouring in full view of your peers while they politely sip spiced wine and whisper about the succession. You walk into this imagined chamber, and the air is stifling. Candles, smoke in sconces, the room swelters with too many bodies, and every sigh from the queen is echoed in murmurs from the crowd. The midwife wipes her brow, whispers encouragement, but the queen cannot cry out too loudly. Royalty was supposed to endure with dignity. Outside, courtiers listen eagerly for the wail of a newborn, straining to hear proof that the kingdom's future has just arrived. The irony is cruel. A moment that should have been intimate, filled with relief and joy, became theatre. Every detail, the sheets, the afterbirth, the baby's first cry, was scrutinized for authenticity. Queens were sometimes forced to display their newborns immediately, holding them up like trophies for witnesses to inspect. "A prince, healthy and legitimate," the herald would cry, even before the mother had time to hold her child close. Historians still debate how these rituals affected queens psychologically. Some suggest that the lack of privacy deepened their isolation, making them feel more like breeding vessels than mothers. Others argue that queens understood the necessity and accepted it as part of their duty. Either way, their bodies were not their own. They were stage sets where politics played out. You lean in the corner of the imagined room, watching the sweat-soaked queen collapse back onto her pillows. The baby, red-faced and wailing, is lifted for the crowd's approval. Applause breaks out, not gentle coos, but clapping, cheering, relief that the dynasty has survived another day. The queen's face softens with exhaustion, her eyes closing as the room continues buzzing. And you realize, as the sound fades into your imagination, that royal childbirth was the ultimate ritual of exposure. From conception to labor, nothing was private, nothing belonged solely to the mother and father. Even the first cry of a newborn was shared with the world. It's a chilling reminder that in palaces, even miracles were staged events. You might not expect this, but when the cradle stayed empty for too long, or when the cries of newborns ended in silence, the ripple could topple thrones. Dynasties, no matter how gilded or powerful, often broke apart not from wars or assassinations, but from something far quieter, the absence of heirs. Picture it, a great hall filled with nobles, banners fluttering, candles blazing. The king sits on his throne, regal but weary. The queen sits beside him, her smile fixed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Behind them, whispers weave through the assembly, still no child. To courtiers, it isn't just sad news, it's a looming crisis. No heir means no certainty. No certainty means rivals waiting, sharpening their daggers and their claims. Here's your mainstream fact. Dynasties throughout Europe rose and fell because of empty cradles. The Tudor dynasty nearly collapsed after multiple infant deaths and miscarriages. The Spanish Habsburgs dwindled to extinction when Charles II, frail and childless, left no heir. Historians still argue whether dynasties broke from sheer biology or from the crushing political pressure that turned every womb into a battlefield. And now the quirky tidbit in some courts, when hopes for children dimmed, kings and queens adopted symbolic heirs, sometimes literally parading noble relatives' children dressed in royal clothing to present an illusion of continuity. Imagine being a 10-year-old cousin suddenly treated like a crown prince at banquets, only to be quietly sidelined when, against all odds, the queen finally conceived. Talk about whiplash. You step into this imagined palace, its marble floors gleaming, its portraits glaring down. You feel the tension, rival dukes exchanging sly smiles, foreign ambassadors sending hurried letters home. The queen has failed, one might write. Prepare your claimant. Even before a dynasty ended, the vultures began to circle. The personal toll was devastating. Queens who miscarried or remained childless often saw their reputation shredded. Some were sent to convents, others quietly erased from court life. Kings, too, could grow desperate, resorting to annulments, remarriages or affairs, all in the name of producing the one thing that could silence the whispers: a healthy heir. You pause and imagine the silent corridors of a palace after another miscarriage. The nursery, prepared with carved cradles and embroidered linens, stands empty. The servants dust it anyway, as if tending to absence itself. Outside, guards march, musicians play, life continues. But in that hushed room, the dynasty itself seems fragile, trembling on the edge of collapse. Historians still debate which was more dangerous: too many heirs, leading to rival claimants and civil war, or too few, leaving a kingdom vulnerable to foreign powers. Both, it seems, spelled disaster. And in both cases, fertility was the axis around which empires spun. You can almost hear the irony. Armies, castles, treasuries, none of it mattered without a crying infant in a cradle. Dynasties that seemed eternal crumbled not because they were conquered, but because they could not reproduce. And so, as you wander this imagined palace, you realize the strangest truth of all. The fall of empires was sometimes written not in treaties or swords, but in silence, the silence of a nursery where no baby ever stirred. You might not expect this, but the very remedies meant to save dynasties sometimes ended up destroying them. Palaces that smelled of roses and beeswax often hid another odor entirely, the bitter tang of medicines gone wrong. Kings and queens desperate for heirs swallowed, rubbed, or inhaled concoctions that promised fertility, but instead delivered weakness, delirium, or even death. Imagine a queen sitting at a carved oak table, silver goblet in hand. The liquid inside looks harmless enough, a dark syrup laced with honey. But the recipe? A lethal cocktail of herbs, minerals, and wishful thinking. She closes her eyes, drinks, and waits for her womb to quicken, never realizing the poison working its way silently through her body. Here's your mainstream fact. Many so-called fertility remedies in the Middle Ages and Renaissance contained toxic substances. Lead was sometimes included in ointments, mercury in tinctures, and cantharidin, from Spanish fly beetles, in powders. Historians still argue whether royal physicians believed these were genuinely curative or whether they prescribed them because kings demanded action, no matter how dangerous. And now the quirky tidbit. One particularly bizarre remedy involved ground-up emeralds. Wealthy monarchs believed drinking gemstone powder mixed with wine could boost vitality and fertility. Of course, emeralds aren't exactly digestible, so the results were more likely an upset stomach than an heir. Imagine coughing politely at dinner while shards of your jewelry collection swirl in your cup. You wander into an imagined royal apothecary, shelves stacked with jars, powders glittering under torchlight, bundles of herbs drying from rafters. The physician measures ingredients with solemn precision, though half his knowledge is guesswork. "This will warm the womb," he says, handing over a paste that smells faintly of resin and metal. The queen swallows obediently, though dread pools in her stomach. The king, meanwhile, isn't spared. He's urged to consume potions said to increase virility, some made from animal organs, others from fiery spices, still others from actual poisons in small doses. The logic was always the same: better to risk sickness than to risk a barren throne. You can almost hear the unspoken joke: survive the cure, and maybe you'll survive your dynasty. Of course, not all remedies were fatal. Some were merely useless, like wearing jade amulets against the skin or sleeping on sheets sprinkled with powdered pearl, but others killed slowly, weakening bodies already burdened with stress. One queen might miscarry after a particularly harsh tonic. Another might fall ill for months. The tragedy was that the remedies themselves were rarely blamed. Instead, the queen's barrenness became more proof of divine displeasure. Historians still debate how much harm these treatments caused. Some suggest they shortened lives, especially for queens forced to endure endless cycles of bleeding, purging, and dosing. Others argue the real damage was psychological: the false hope, the constant rituals, the sense that one's body was a problem to be fixed at any cost. You pause, picturing the royal chamber once more. The queen lies in bed, pale and trembling, her attendants fanning her, while the physician insists she will improve. Outside the door, courtiers whisper impatiently about heirs. No one asks whether the cure is the cause of her suffering. The dynasty demands results, not questions, and so the irony bites deep. Palaces gleaming with marble and gold were often poisoned from within, not by assassins, but by the very remedies poured into goblets and painted onto skin. Fertility rituals promised life, yet delivered decay. As you drift here, the scent of herbs and bitter powders clinging to the air, you realize how fragile royal survival truly was. For all their crowns and armies, monarchs gambled their bodies on dubious recipes, hoping for heirs, but too often swallowing their own undoing. You might not expect this, but fertility in palaces wasn't just about queens being scrutinized. Kings, too, lived under the unspoken terror that their own virility might be questioned. Masculinity was a performance as much as sovereignty, and no monarch could afford to look weak in the eyes of his court. The crown on his head was only as secure as the whispers about his potency. Picture it. The king strides into the great hall, cloak sweeping behind him, jewels glinting in candlelight. Courtiers bow deeply, yet their eyes flicker with subtle curiosity. Has he sired an heir yet? Does the queen's belly swell? Every joke about hunting, every toast to fertile fields, carries a double meaning. The king laughs loudly, but inside, perhaps he wonders if they're laughing at him. Here's your mainstream fact: masculinity and fertility were deeply entwined in royal image. Henry VIII of England, desperate to prove his virility, paraded mistresses and emphasized his athleticism, yet historians today suspect he may have struggled with conditions that affected conception. Historians still argue whether kings' reputations were genuinely damaged by suspected infertility, or whether political rivals simply exploited the rumor as a weapon. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some courts, kings wore belts embroidered with fertility symbols, plump grapes, rampant lions, or even, quite bluntly, little stitched phalluses. Imagine the absurdity: a ruler who commands armies and wealth beyond measure, strapping on an embroidered reminder before bed as if it were armor. You step into an imagined hunting lodge where the king lounges before a roaring fire, boasting of his conquests. Around him, courtiers nod, laugh, and echo his words. But beneath the bravado lies anxiety. If the queen hasn't conceived, tongues wag. Some whisper that he's cursed. Others suggest the throne is vulnerable. And the king, who can crush rebellions with armies, cannot crush the nagging question of whether his own body is betraying him. Masculinity had to be performed constantly. Kings rode horses into tournaments, lifted lances in jousts, hunted boars with reckless flair. Every public act reinforced the image of virility. If the cradle remained empty, the spectacle had to get louder, prove strength in the field, even if weakness lurked in the bedchamber. You can almost hear the strain, the sound of hooves pounding in tournaments, the shouts of spectators as the king unhorses an opponent, the triumphant smile hiding a private fear. He must always appear unstoppable. To falter was to invite not just ridicule, but rebellion. Historians still debate how kings navigated this performance. Did they believe their own bravado, or were they acutely aware of the theatre they played? Letters and diaries suggest both, moments of swagger and moments of despair. Behind closed doors, even monarchs confessed doubts to their closest advisers, whispering the same questions ordinary men whispered in taverns. Am I the problem? And so the rituals multiplied. Kings drank strange tonics, bathed in mineral waters, clutched charms said to invigorate the blood. They sought mistresses not always for love, but to prove to the court and themselves that they could father children. Every illegitimate baby born was another brick in the wall of masculine reputation, proof that the king was strong, even if the queen was blamed for the lack of heirs. You lean against the imagined pillar of this hall, watching the firelight flicker across the king's face. His laugh is loud, his posture broad, but when the hall empties, he stares at the flames too long, lost in thought. The mask of masculinity is heavy, even for a crown wearer. And you realize as your breath slows with the crackle of logs that kings were just as vulnerable as queens. Their thrones were not just guarded by soldiers, but by fragile illusions stitched into belts, whispered in corridors and performed in tournaments. In the theatre of fertility, the king's body was a stage, and the audience never stopped watching. You might not expect this, but sometimes the most powerful evidence of royal fertility wasn't a baby at all, it was a bedsheet. Yes, in the strange logic of dynastic politics, damp linens were paraded like legal documents, displayed to courtiers as proof that a marriage had been consummated, that the seed of an heir had been properly planted. Picture the chamber at dawn. The torches have burned low, the queen lies weary beneath a canopy of embroidered silk, and the king sits upright, face stern, as attendants enter. They don't bow deeply. They look instead toward the bed. A servant gathers the sheets, careful not to wrinkle the dampness. Within minutes, those linens will be carried into the great hall and unfurled before nobles, who nod gravely, as if inspecting a treaty. Romance reduced to laundry. Here's your mainstream fact. The proof of consummation ritual was practiced in several European courts, most famously in France and Spain. A public display of sheets, sometimes even accompanied by cheers or prayers, was meant to prevent disputes over legitimacy. Historians still argue whether this was universal practice or exaggerated in chronicles for scandalous effect, but the tradition appears in enough records to suggest it was real. And here's the quirky tidbit. In some French villages, when common couples married, locals would hang the bedsheet out the window the next morning as proof of consummation. Nobles adapted the custom in their own way, turning what was a rustic joke into a solemn state ritual. Imagine the contrast. Peasants laughing at laundry lines, dukes squinting at linens like forensic experts. You wander into the imagined great hall where the sheet is stretched between two servants. Courtiers lean forward, eyes narrowed, as though the damp fabric holds the fate of kingdoms. Murmurs ripple. It is done. An heir may come. The irony is sharp. The most intimate act of two people becomes a collective sigh of relief for hundreds. The queen, meanwhile, feels humiliation more than triumph. To her, the sheet is not proof of love or intimacy, but a report card. To the king, it is a safeguard against rumors of impotence. Together, they are reduced to a spectacle, their marriage certified not by affection, but by damp cotton. Historians still debate whether the sheets were always genuine. Some suggest attendants doctored them, staining fabric with animal blood or wine if necessary, to preserve appearances. After all, the dynasty could not risk a scandal on the very first night. Truth in this ritual mattered less than the perception of truth. You pause, listening to the shuffle of feet as the sheet is carried away, folded back into secrecy. Outside, heralds spread the word. The marriage is valid, the union complete. The crowd cheers, though the couple themselves may feel nothing but exhaustion and dread. It's absurd and a little funny. You can almost imagine an exasperated queen muttering, "All this over laundry?" Yet it was deadly serious. Without proof of consummation, future heirs could be challenged, wars could be sparked, dynasties could fracture. A bedsheet, flimsy as it seems, could hold the weight of an empire. And so, as the firelight flickers on the palace walls, you realize how strange royal rituals could be. Power wasn't just crowns, battles, and treaties. Sometimes it was damp fabric lifted high before a room full of nobles, an awkward relic of intimacy turned into a cornerstone of legitimacy. You might not expect this, but in the end, every successful royal birth produced more than just a baby. It produced a weapon. Heirs were never simply children. They were chess pieces on a political board, little bundles of potential wars, alliances, and treaties swaddled in silk. From the moment a prince or princess wailed into the palace air, their cries echoed far beyond the nursery. Imagine the scene. The queen lies exhausted, her face pale against embroidered pillows. The midwife holds up the newborn, red-faced and squirming. A herald rushes out into the great hall to proclaim a son or a daughter. Instantly, ambassadors scribble letters home, dukes exchange knowing glances, and foreign rulers begin recalculating strategies. The nursery becomes a battlefield in miniature. Here's your mainstream fact. Throughout history, royal heirs were leveraged in politics the moment they were born. Mary, Queen of Scots, was betrothed at just 6 months old. The Habsburgs famously married their children across Europe to knit alliances, creating a web so tangled it earned them the saying, "Let others wage war, you happy Austria, marry." Historians still argue whether these alliances truly stabilized kingdoms or simply delayed inevitable conflicts. And now the quirky tidbit. In some courts, newborn heirs were immediately given mock titles for amusement. In 16th century France, a baby might be called Duke of the Cradle until an official title was assigned. Picture courtiers bowing solemnly before a squirming infant, addressing him as Your Grace while he spits up milk. You step into the imagined nursery, and it is nothing like a private family room. Gilded cradles, tapestries, and banners crowd the walls. Ambassadors linger in corners, eager for the first glimpse. Nobles jostle politely to see if the infant looks more like the king or queen, because resemblance itself is politics. A baby with the king's nose is a blessing. A baby who looks suspiciously like a courtier could ignite scandal. The queen watches silently, perhaps too tired to care. For her, the baby is relief, the end of months or years of whispered blame. For the king, it is victory, proof of virility, and a guarantee of dynastic continuity. And for everyone else, it is leverage, a marriage to be arranged, a treaty to be sealed, a pawn to be moved. Sometimes the birth of an heir prevented war, sometimes it caused one. Rival kingdoms plotted to marry their children together, but when those marriages soured, the alliances unraveled into battles. The baby in the cradle was never just an innocent, it was a contract in human form. Historians still debate whether royal children were cherished as individuals or primarily as political tools. Diaries suggest both. Some monarchs adored their offspring, playing with them, writing them letters of affection. Others treated them coldly, as if affection would make it harder to marry them off like bargaining chips. The truth lies somewhere between the rattle and the treaty. You lean against the nursery wall, listening to the baby's cries. Outside, bells toll across the city, celebrating an heir. Crowds cheer in the streets, not because they love the child, but because the dynasty has survived another day. The baby may not yet know its own name, but already its existence holds armies in check or sets them in motion, and you realize as the candles burn low and the baby drifts into restless sleep, that heirs were never simply children. They were the sharpest weapons in the royal arsenal, wielded not with swords but with lullabies. You might not expect this, but when you sift through dusty chronicles and yellowed letters, you find that not even historians can agree on what all these rituals really meant. Were they genuine acts of faith, elaborate medical treatments, or simply theatre staged for anxious audiences? Fertility in royal courts was never just about biology, it was about perception. And perception, like history itself, is slippery. Imagine stepping into a library lit by tall windows. Scholars sit hunched over manuscripts, their quills scratching as they argue in hushed voices. One insists these fertility charms were nothing but superstition, quaint relics of an ignorant age. Another shakes his head. No, they were part of a larger performance of power. Rituals meant to reassure subjects that the monarchy was doing everything possible. A third interrupts. Perhaps they really believed them. Who are we to judge belief? By modern standards? The debate swirls like smoke. Here's your mainstream fact. Historians today remain divided on whether fertility rituals in palaces were primarily spiritual, medical, or political. Some emphasize their role as public theatre, designed to show that rulers sought divine favor. Others highlight their connection to medical theories of the time. Historians still argue whether these acts actually influenced dynasties or whether they were symbolic gestures with no practical effect. Now for the quirky tidbit, one 16th century chronicler in Spain wrote with a straight face that a queen's fertility success came after she drank water in which the king's sword had been dipped. Some modern scholars dismiss this as satire. Others wonder if the chronicler was describing a ritual seriously performed. Imagine an academic footnote solemnly debating sword-flavored water. You wander deeper into this imagined archive, brushing your fingers across cracked spines and brittle pages. The margins are filled with notes by scholars centuries apart, each with their own agenda. In the flicker of candlelight, the disagreements seem alive, proof that even now the truth of royal fertility remains contested. The debates matter because perception mattered. A queen caught crawling under an altar might be condemned as superstitious or praised as devout. A king swallowing a bizarre potion might be mocked as foolish or admired as determined. The meaning lay not in the ritual itself, but in how it was spun, then and now. You pause, listening to the quills scratching, the scholars muttering. We cannot know, one sighs away, whether these rituals worked. But they worked, another counters, because people believed they did, and belief itself has power. That's the haunting part. Whether superstition, science, or theatre, fertility rituals shaped dynasties precisely because everyone acted as if they mattered. Empty cradles toppled empires, damp sheets quelled rumours, charms in sleeves reassured anxious queens. Even the most absurd concoctions carried weight because they gave hope, however fleeting. You lean back in the imagined chair, the musty smell of parchment filling your nose. Historians may still quarrel, but the lived reality for kings and queens was simple. Their bodies were not private, their hopes were public, and rituals, whether sacred or silly, were their only tools against uncertainty. And as you close the heavy book and let it thump onto the table, you realize that history isn't about answers here. It's about the endless questions, the debates that refuse to die. Fertility rituals in palaces may never be fully understood, but their echoes remain, half faith, half theatre, entirely human. You might not expect this, but the obsession with fertility rituals wasn't confined to the glittering courts of Europe. Across the world, kings, queens, and emperors leaned on equally strange, equally desperate practices, each culture blending superstition, medicine, and politics into its own recipe for heirs. From honeyed offerings in Egypt to jade charms in China, the longing for children stretched far beyond castle walls. Imagine drifting through time and geography. First stop, ancient Egypt. You step into a temple courtyard bathed in golden sun, where priests crush pomegranates and honey together, offering the mixture to hopeful couples. Women swallow these sticky concoctions, believing sweetness invites life. And in the dim shadows of the sanctuary, statues of Hathor, goddess of fertility, smile serenely as if to say, hope is universal. Here's your mainstream fact. Egyptian texts from as early as 1800 BCE describe fertility treatments using honey, dates, and herbs, some applied as vaginal suppositories. Historians still argue whether these were effective contraceptives, fertility aids, or both, but they reveal how seriously the ancients took the idea that the right recipe could shape dynasties. And now the quirky tidbit. In India, some royal couples were advised to sleep with carved jade elephants under their bed, the animals symbolizing strength and prosperity. The belief was that the spirit of the elephant would bless the womb with endurance. Imagine a queen trying to sleep while her attendants carefully slide a tiny zoo beneath her mattress. You wander further east in this imagined journey, stepping into a Chinese palace where the emperor clutches a smooth jade talisman. In Ming dynasty courts, jade was believed to cool the body and harmonize energies, making conception more likely. Astrologers set the timing, while herbalists prepared teas of ginseng and goji. Even the most powerful man in the Middle Kingdom lay awake wondering if the stars and the herbs would cooperate. Further still, in the Andes, Inca rulers chewed coca leaves before lying with their wives, convinced it granted vigor and pleased the gods. The rituals may differ, but the pressure was the same. Without heirs, even the strongest empires trembled. Historians still debate how these cross-continental practices spread. Were they echoes of shared human anxiety, or did trade routes carry remedies and superstitions alongside spices and silks? A charm in Paris might not look so different from one in Cairo. Once you scrape away the cultural flourishes, you pause in an imagined bazaar, stalls piled high with herbs, minerals, and charms. A merchant waves a bundle of dried figs at you, promising they'll ensure fertility. Another offers polished stones engraved with symbols. Behind them, a woman quietly sells amulets wrapped in cloth. Each culture, each kingdom, believed its own recipe was the secret. Yet beneath it all, the longing was the same. The irony is sweet and sharp. No matter how different the languages, gods, or palaces, everyone searched for the same answer. A child, an heir, a future. From crocodile dung in Egypt to jade charms in China, the rituals seem absurd to us now, but to them they were the difference between survival and collapse. And as you drift across this imagined map, you realize that fertility rituals were never just about one culture. They were the quiet heartbeat of human history, echoing through temples, shrines, and palaces alike. You might not expect this, but while the strangest rituals of history feel like relics of a bygone world, echoes of them are still with us. Fertility may no longer be debated beneath cathedral arches or certified with damp bedsheets, but the pressure, the superstition, and the desperate search for answers linger quietly in modern lives. The royal palaces of old aren't so different from fertility clinics today, each filled with hope, anxiety, and rituals dressed up as science or faith. Picture it, a glossy magazine cover in a waiting room promising 10 foods to boost fertility. Inside, a couple sits hand in hand waiting for test results, just as kings and queens once sat waiting for the verdict of their physicians. The language has changed, but the feeling, it's hauntingly familiar. Here's your mainstream fact: in vitro fertilization, IVF, today has helped millions of families conceive, but even with advanced science, success rates are not guaranteed. Modern medicine offers precision that medieval alchemists never dreamed of, yet the emotional stakes remain just as high. Historians still argue whether our obsession with fertility today is any less fraught than it was in dynastic courts, or whether we've simply swapped saints and charms for lab coats and syringes. And now the quirky tidbit: some modern couples still turn to rituals that wouldn't look out of place in an old palace. Lucky charms tucked under pillows, special diets involving pomegranate juice or pineapple cores, even astrologers and psychics offering favorable dates for conception. You can almost hear the medieval echoes. "Sorry, darling, Jupiter is grumpy tonight. We'll try again Thursday." You wander into this imagined modern clinic, white walls humming with fluorescent light. Couples glance nervously at clipboards, doctors murmur about timing and procedures. It feels clinical, efficient, but beneath the surface lies the same desperation queens once felt, the same whispered prayers in candlelit chapels. Hope never changes its tone. The societal pressure lingers too. In some cultures today, childlessness still carries stigma, just as it did centuries ago. Families whisper, friends suggest remedies, strangers pry with questions. For royals, it was dynasties on the line. For modern couples, it may be family expectations. Different scale, same weight. Historians still debate whether fertility has ever been a private matter at all. Even now, celebrity pregnancies are dissected in tabloids, rumours swirl when couples remain childless, and news of royal births, think William and Kate, Harry and Meghan, still dominate headlines as if heirs alone keep the world turning. You smile wryly at the continuity. Once it was crocodile dung, rooster testicles, and saintly relics. Now it's prenatal vitamins, apps that track ovulation, and acupuncture appointments. Different costumes, same drama, and always the same human heartbeat, the longing for life to carry forward. You close your eyes and hear the hum of the clinic fade into the hush of a medieval chapel, the scent of antiseptic blending with incense, the whispers of doctors mingling with prayers of midwives. Time collapses and you realize fertility rituals never disappeared. They just traded their robes for scrubs. You might not expect this, but for every triumphant queen who finally produced an heir, there were dozens whose names you'll never hear. Women erased from chronicles because their wombs stayed empty. These forgotten royals haunt the margins of history, their portraits lost, their stories reduced to single damning words: barren, unfruitful, failed. Imagine walking through a gallery of faded paintings. Kings glare sternly down from gilded frames, their legacies carefully preserved. But beside them, empty spaces where queens should have been. The women who bore no children, or whose babies never survived, were quietly brushed from the record, their lives rewritten as cautionary tales. Their crowns glittered just as brightly, but history treated them like broken links in the chain of dynasty. Here's your mainstream fact. Catherine Howard, fifth wife of Henry VIII, was condemned for infidelity, but part of her downfall was the whispered reminder that she hadn't produced an heir. Anne of Austria, Queen of France, endured over 20 years of ridicule before finally giving birth to Louis XIV, and countless other queens simply disappeared from prominence once it became clear they would not provide successors. Historians still argue whether these women were victims of biology, politics, or both. Now the quirky tidbit: in 17th century Poland, one queen reportedly tried to protect her reputation by commissioning portraits of herself surrounded by cherubs, hoping to distract from the fact that she had none of her own. Imagine the awkwardness of smiling beside painted children while courtiers whispered about the nursery that remained empty. You step into an imagined palace garden where one of these forgotten queens strolls alone. Her gown trails across gravel paths, her face hidden beneath a veil. She hears the laughter of courtiers in the distance, but feels no welcome. To her, the roses in bloom are reminders of what she cannot produce, living legacies. Every blossom that fades is another reminder of time slipping away. And when she is gone, her name barely lingers. Chroniclers gloss over her reign, focusing instead on the king's next wife, the one who might succeed where she failed. Her jewels are passed down, her gowns cut apart, her memory reduced to whispers in archives. She becomes a ghost, present in lineage charts as a blank line, nothing more. Historians still debate how these women experienced their silence. Some likely retreated into prayer, turning their sorrow into piety. Others may have grown bitter, their letters, if they survive, hinting at frustration, but most are simply lost. They remind us that history is written not only by victors, but also by heirs. No heirs, no legacy. You lean against a marble column in the imagined gallery, staring at those blank spaces on the walls. The forgotten queens whisper around you, their voices thin as wind. We were here too, we wore crowns. We endured the same rituals, the same pressure. We mattered, even if no child carried our names forward. And you realize as your breath slows that their erasure is the final cruelty. These women lived lives as vivid as any, yet because the cradle stayed empty, they slipped into shadows. Their stories remind us that dynasties weren't only built on heirs, they were also scarred by the silence of forgotten queens. You might not expect this, but after centuries of anxious rituals, candles burning in chapels, charms sewn into gowns, sheets displayed to courtiers, fertility in royal palaces finally drifts into something quieter. The torches of history flicker low now, and what remains is not the spectacle, but the hush that followed. In those private moments, when the curtains were drawn and the courtiers dispersed, kings and queens lay awake, listening to their own hearts thump with both hope and despair. Imagine the palace at night. The great hall is empty, its chandeliers dark, its echoes softened by silence. The nursery, prepared with gilded cradles, sits waiting, shadows pooling in corners where no infant stirs. Outside, the moon casts pale light on the gardens, silvering the roses that bloom and wither in their own time. And within the royal bedchamber, two figures lie side by side, their crowns removed, their worries unmasked. Here's your mainstream fact. Fertility rituals persisted in Europe well into the 18th century, long after modern medicine began to emerge. Even Enlightenment thinkers who doubted astrology or charms still lit candles to saints or followed careful diets in pursuit of heirs. Historians still argue whether this persistence reveals human gullibility or simply human need, the refusal to give up hope when so much was at stake. And the quirky tidbit. In some German principalities, when a royal heir was finally born, villagers celebrated not only with feasts but with fertility plays, comic performances mocking barren couples. The irony? The royals themselves had often spent decades enduring the very pain the villagers turned into entertainment. You drift through the imagined corridors one last time. The perfumes of herbs, the clang of talismans, the smoky haze of incense, they all fade now into echoes. What lingers isn't the strangeness of crocodile dung or jade charms, it's the very human fragility that lay beneath. For all their power, royals were never immune to the most ordinary of struggles, the longing for a child, the fear of failure, the ache of being judged by forces beyond their control. The story has carried you across centuries, through moonlit chapels, milk-filled baths, and courtly whispers sharper than daggers. It has shown you the theatre, the faith, and the desperation woven into every ritual. And now, as the palace grows quiet, the tale too begins to soften, so let the light dim now. Let the voices of courtiers and physicians fall silent, their debates fading into the hush of night. The heavy tapestries sway gently in the draught, muffling the echoes of ritual chants and anxious prayers. Beyond the palace walls, the stars wheel slowly in their eternal dance, indifferent to the dynasties fretting beneath them. You feel yourself settling deeper, as though you too have walked the corridors of marble and velvet, witnessed the strange potions and talismans, the public births and whispered failures. The images linger, but they lose their sharp edges, softening into the kind of memory that drifts like mist over a garden at dawn. Even the most powerful kings and queens, wrapped in gold and authority, were not so different from anyone else. They, too, lay awake in the dark, waiting, hoping, praying. Their rituals may seem absurd to us now, but beneath them was something timeless. The need to believe, the need to try, the need to quiet the heart's own restless beating. Let the palace fade now into a blur of candlelight, the scent of lavender and beeswax carrying you further into calm. The empty cradles, the heavy crowns, the echoing halls, all of it dissolves until only quiet remains. And in that quiet, you are safe. There are no courtiers whispering about your worth, no physicians pressing bitter tonics into your hands, no rituals demanding your dignity. There is only the steady rhythm of your breath, the gentle hum of the night around you, and the slow, comforting weight of rest settling in. So close your eyes, let the story slip away, and drift into sleep.